This video has been sponsored by NordVPN. You can go to nordvpn.com/NileRed to get 77% off a 3-year plan. Over the last couple months, I've been experimenting with an iron-based pigment called Prussian blue, and this is the last video in a series of 3. In the first video, I focused mostly on the Prussian blue itself, and I made it from 2 main chemicals, potassium ferrocyanide and ferric chloride. I unfortunately wasn't able to make the ferrocyanide myself, but I was able to make the ferric chloride completely from household materials. I made saturated solutions of both of them, and when I mixed them together, Prussian blue precipitated out. I mixed it around a lot to make sure that everything fully reacted, and then I filtered it off and let it dry. Then a few days later, I turned it into a really fine powder using a coffee grinder. It could have been used as a pigment to color many things, but I decided to make my own oil paint. And with the paint that I made, I tried out oil painting for the first time, and the results were honestly not as bad as I thought they would be. In the second video, I explored its more specialized use in a process called cyanotype. In cyanotype, the Prussian blue is formed directly in the paper, and it was historically used to make blueprints. To do this though, I had to convert the ferric chloride that I made in the first video into a different iron compound which was sensitive to UV light. The procedure and process that I used was found in an old paper, and I was honestly surprised by how well it worked. This new green iron compound, called ferric ammonium citrate, was then dissolved in water and combined with a solution of potassium ferricyanide instead of ferrocyanide like before. There's no reaction between these two compounds, and the mixture was applied to some printer paper. I made a transparent template using a Sharpie in a plastic bag, and I sandwiched everything between 2 pieces of glass. Then I brought all of this outside, and I exposed it to sunlight for a few minutes. When I felt it had been exposed enough, I brought it back inside and I developed it by just dropping it into water. The result was honestly a pretty low quality cyanotype, but I was still happy with it because it showed that I was successful at making the ferric ammonium citrate. So with that being said, for this video, I wanted to experiment a bit more with this whole process of cyanotype. The print that I made in the last video was mostly just a proof of concept, and I only used supplies that I had lying around the office. With the right setup though, it's possible to make some highly detailed and really cool looking prints. My plan for this video was to first develop some digital photos, and then to just mess around with the process a little to get a better understanding of it. I also wanted to try toning some of my prints, which would allow me to change the color. One thing that I want to mention as well is that if you want to repeat the process that you see here, you don't have to make the chemicals yourself, and you can probably find them somewhere online. In any case, the first step for this project was to make transparent negatives from digital photos. To do this, I was of course going to need some transparencies, so I just went online and I bought a pack from Amazon. I got the ones that said they were compatible with laser printers because, well, I have a laser printer, but there are other ones that are meant for inkjets. After making the order, they were going to take a few days to arrive, so in the meantime, I prepared my digital photos. As an example, I'm going to use this photo that I took when I was in Singapore a few years ago. This was my raw, unedited photo from the camera, but it already looked pretty good, so I didn't really have to edit it very much. Many photos can take a lot of work to make them presentable, but for this one, I just added a small amount of brightness, contrast, and saturation. Then when I was happy with how it looked, I converted it to black and white. The next thing to do was to turn it into a negative, which was as easy as just highlighting everything and using the invert function. After inverting it, I increased the contrast a bit more, and I crushed some of the highlights that I thought were too bright. At this point, I was happy with how it looked, so I saved it and moved on to editing the other photos. When my transparencies finally arrived a few days later, I tried printing my negatives onto them. Compared to the digital file though, it wasn't as good because the resolution of my printer wasn't the best. It also made some nasty lines in some photos, which you can pretty clearly see in this one. I tried a whole bunch of different things to fix it, as well as a lot of different settings, but I think it was just, in the end, a problem with the printer itself. It only seemed to be a problem with some photos though, so for those ones, I just had them printed at the store. The quality of these ones were obviously a lot better, but besides taking out the lines, I didn't find they made much of a difference in the final print. The next thing to do was to choose the paper that I would be developing the cyanotype on. It is possible to use something like printer paper like I did before, but it really doesn't work very well. In my experience, it's a much better idea to pick up some of the higher quality art stuff. There are many options out there, but I found that I like the mixed media type the best, but it's also possible to use something like watercolor paper. Both of these types allow the cyanotype mixture to be applied and spread out evenly. These papers are also thicker and denser, and they can easily withstand multiple water washings without falling apart. Okay, so now to make this cyanotype, I needed to mix some chemicals. There were many different recipes to choose from, and I kind of just randomly went with this one, which used 20% ferric ammonium citrate and 14% potassium ferrocyanide. So in the first beaker, I added 2 grams of the ferric ammonium citrate, which I'll just call FAC from this point on, and in the other one, I added 1.4 grams of the potassium ferrocyanide. Then to each of them, I added 10 ml of distilled water. I swirled them around until everything dissolved, and then I mixed them together. There was no reaction going on here, but there was still a slight change in color. According to a lot of sources that I found, this was just because mixing the two solutions formed an emulsion, but it kind of didn't explain anything past that. If any of you guys have more details about it though, I'd love to hear it in the comments. In any case, a small amount of this solution was then shot onto my mixed media paper and spread out as evenly as possible. I repeated this process on several pieces of paper, and then I put them somewhere dark to dry. After it dries, some people like to apply a second coat, but I found that just one worked well enough for me. Before moving on, one thing that I just want to mention is that this entire preparation is sensitive to UV, so it absolutely has to be protected from sunlight. This doesn't mean you have to work in the dark though, because from my experience, most household lights don't produce much or any UV, so you're fine working under those. A few hours later, when the papers were dry, I moved on to the next step. I put the paper on a sheet of glass that I got from an IKEA display cabinet, and on top of the paper, I carefully placed the negative. Then, using another sheet of glass, I sandwiched everything. It is possible to do it without the glass, and I have done it before, it just doesn't turn out as well. The paper gets a bit warped after treating it with the emulsion, so if the negative is just sat on top of it loosely, there are going to be spaces between it and the paper. Sometimes these spaces are small enough that it doesn't really lead to a noticeable effect, but in other cases like this one, it can be a disaster. One thing that I do want to point out though, is that this print looks slightly worse here than it does in real life. The major reason for this is that the scanning process amplifies the texture of the paper. To get around this, I would have had to do a bunch of tricks in Photoshop, but I didn't really think it was worth it. I just want you to keep this in mind though, when you see the other prints that I show in this video. In any case, my setup was now ready to go, so I put it outside in the sun. I exposed it for a total of about 11 minutes, and the color slowly changed to a light brown. What was going on here was the UV-catalyzed degradation of the ferric ammonium citrate. It was normally made from iron 3+, but the UV triggered a photochemical reaction where the citrate donated electrons to the iron and reduced it to iron 2+. Because it was UV catalyzed, the reaction occurred most prominently in the transparent parts of the negative, but it was mostly blocked in the areas that were darker. On the other hand, the other component, potassium ferrocyanide, didn't react with the UV and it kinda just sat there. It becomes very important in the next step though, and you'll see exactly why. When it was done, I brought it inside, and I took off the top sheet of glass. I made a mistake here, and the paper I was using was a bit too big for my developing bath, so I had to quickly cut off the sides. When I was done with that, I pulled away the negative, and you can see that all the spots that were covered were much lighter on the paper. To develop it, and to make the actual Prussian blue in the paper, I just had to add it to water. When it got wet, the iron 2+ ions from the degraded FAC and the potassium ferrocyanide were able to dissolve into the water. However, almost immediately, while they were still in the paper, they came into contact with each other and formed insoluble Prussian blue. The parts of the negative that were darker shielded a lot of the UV and prevented most of the FAC from degrading. So in these spots, no reaction occurred with the ferrocyanide, and instead, both components just dissolved into the water and got washed away. Because of this, the darker the spot was on the transparency, the lighter it'll be on the paper, and vice versa. This leads to an inversion, but because the image on the transparency was already an inversion, the final result is the original image. I then prepared a bath of very dilute hydrogen peroxide and I dropped in the print. The purpose of this step is to fully oxidize the Prussian blue and to darken it, but it is technically optional. It's also possible to just let the cyanotype sit out in air, and over time it will slowly oxidize and darken. After about 30 seconds in this peroxide bath, I took out the print and I washed it with a copious amount of water. Although I was happy that the process technically worked, my cyanotype was pretty severely overexposed. This was my fault though, and I had just left it in the sun for way too long, and too much FAC was allowed to degrade. By the time that it was dry, it had lightened up quite a bit, but it was still clearly overexposed, and because of this, a lot of detail was lost. There were also some dark spots in the print, and I think they were there because I messed up preparing the paper. I'm pretty sure I just let the emulsion sit for too long before spreading it out, so it got some more concentrated spots. I really wanted to get the proper exposure though, so I cut up some test strips and I used them as probes to try to find out what the ideal time would be. I left a few out in the sun for varying times, and I found that a good exposure was something around 3 minutes. So I set things up again, put my negative on the paper, and exposed it for 3 minutes. Then I brought it inside and developed it, and I was disappointed. Even after treating it with the peroxide, it was still a bit underexposed. The major reason this happened was because of an oversight on my part, and I forgot that both the glass and the transparency block some UV. So just leaving the test strips out in the open isn't actually very useful. In order for them to be accurate, they need to be under the glass and under a transparency. Even if I had done this from the beginning though, there was still one major problem with my test. It assumes that UV levels remain constant between runs, which is pretty much never the case. More often than not, random clouds will block the sun, and on top of this, UV levels aren't even constant throughout the day. So basically, unless you have a UV lamp or some other artificial source, it's kind of pointless to try to figure out an ideal exposure time. The question now though is how do we get to the right exposure level if we can't base it on time? Well, there's two main ways, and the first one is to just visually track it based on the color change. This takes a lot of experience though, which I don't have, so I went with the second method. This one uses test strips like I made earlier, except it gets around all of the problems that I mentioned by tracking things in real time. To do this, I'll include another transparency on the side of the glass, and I'll wedge a bunch of test strips under it. Then as the reaction proceeds, I'll randomly take them out and develop them, and I'll stop it when it gets to a point that I like. By applying this technique, I tried to develop the same image again, and it turned out way better this time. I ended up exposing it for about 5 minutes, and in my opinion, it was almost perfect. I felt that maybe it was slightly overexposed, but I was still very happy with it. After doing these runs though, and several others, I started to wonder how the exposure level scaled in relation to time. So I made another print, but while it was exposed to the sun, I slowly covered it. I unfortunately didn't have anything to take proper measurements from the result, but visually, the exposure level didn't appear to be directly related to time. It looked like the biggest gains were made in the first 3.5 minutes, and then the rate slowed down. Assuming my observation was actually accurate, this made sense to me because at the beginning, there was a high concentration of FAC in the paper. And because there were so many more FAC molecules, they were just much more likely to be hit by UV photons. This would cause a good portion of them to react fairly quickly, but as the concentration decreased, they'd be less and less likely to be hit by the UV. I couldn't find any real info about the kinetics of this reaction, but it probably looks similar to this exponential decay curve. The majority of the progress is made at the beginning of the reaction, but the reaction rate's constantly slowing down, so it slowly tapers off. My major takeaway from this was that relating time to exposure level was even harder than I initially thought. For example, if you want your 3-minute print to be twice as dark, even if the UV levels were constant, you'd have to expose it for more than twice as long. Exactly how much longer it would have to be though, I have no idea. Or in another case, if you had 2 prints at 4 and 8 minutes, but you wanted the exposure level in the middle of the two, you couldn't just go with 6 minutes. The actual so-called middle of the two would probably skew slightly closer to the 4-minute mark. As I said earlier though, the solution to this is to not pay too much attention to the exposure time. You just either need to use test strips or get good at visually tracking the reaction. What I wanted to do next was to experiment with the balance of the FAC and the ferrocyanide. So I went ahead and made 3 new mixtures, where this first one had a fourth of the amount of the ferrocyanide, this one had 4 times the amount, this one had an increased amount of both the FAC and the ferrocyanide, and this last one was just the original recipe. For this test, I also decided to use a new negative, but the photo for this one wasn't mine. A long time ago, I put out a tweet, and I had people send me photos, and I picked out a few that I liked. This one in particular was sent to me by Arkady from Armenia. In any case, getting back to the experiment, I waited for a sunny and cloudless day, and then I exposed them all for the same amount of time. Each run probably got a slightly different amount of UV, but in this case, it didn't really matter. All the mixtures had a very different chemical composition, and the effect of that definitely overshadowed any fluctuations in UV level. As a side note, I actually messed up here, and I accidentally put the negative on backwards. I ended up doing it for all the other runs as well, but it didn't really matter because it was just a test. However, it was something that I made sure to pay attention to in all the runs that I did after this. After exposing them, I took them inside, and they all looked quite different. I moved on to developing them, and I started with the one with the regular recipe. It ended up being quite underexposed, but this was done purposely, and I'll explain why in a bit. The next one to be developed was the more concentrated one, and it initially looked darker. However, most of the Prussian blue seemed to just come off the paper and dissolve into the water, and it ended up being more underexposed than the last one. This third one was with the really large excess of ferrocyanide, and there was effectively no image. Just to be consistent with the other runs, I still put it in the peroxide bath, but nothing really happened. Now for the last one, with much less ferrocyanide, the exposure was actually quite good, and I got a nice rich blue color. This run clearly went a lot faster than the others, and it was the reason why I had to keep them underexposed. If I let the other ones get to the proper exposure level, this one just would have been a complete mess. I initially thought that this last one was the best out of all of them, but after looking at it more closely, I realized that it was actually really low quality. If you compare it to the other ones, you might be able to notice that it doesn't have very good details. A lot of the flowers and branches just blend into the background and become almost invisible. The one with the original recipe was really underexposed, but you could still see way more detail in it. The major reason why this happened was because of the low concentration of the ferrocyanide. As I mentioned earlier, when the paper is put into water to develop it, the chemicals need to dissolve into the water and react in solution to make the Prussian blue. However, if the concentration of the ferrocyanide is super low, the degraded FAC needs to travel further to find it. This causes a bleeding effect, and details tend to be lost. The other major effect of a lower concentration of ferrocyanide is that there's less of it to absorb and block the UV light. This allows more UV to reach the FAC and degrade it, therefore lowering the development time. On the flip side though, when there's more ferrocyanide, it means that it's harder for the UV to get to the FAC. This effect was best demonstrated by the run, where I used 4 times the amount of the ferrocyanide, and pretty much no image ended up being developed. For the run that I increased the concentration of both of them, I tried to offset the increase of the ferrocyanide with a larger increase of the FAC. It didn't seem to work though, but it did make sense because if the UV's not even getting there, it doesn't matter if you increase the amount of the FAC. In this run, a lot of the blue color was also washed away, but I'm not exactly sure why. If you guys have the answer for this though, or just any theories, I'd love to hear it in the comments. In any case, I think my major takeaway from this is that the concentration of both chemicals is really important. A good recipe is a careful balance of the two, and it allows for good details without taking too much time. I personally really like the recipe that I started with, but there are many other variations out there. There are even some that use ferric oxalate instead of FAC, as well as some other chemical additives. A lot of them claim to be a lot better than the old recipe, but I've yet to try them out myself. Maybe in the future though, I'll do a video on it if there's enough interest. Before I go though, the last thing that I wanted to do was to try toning my prints. In general, the toning process is relatively simple, and by just using coffee, tea, or anything that contains tannins, it's possible to change the color of the cyanotype. However, I'm not going to get into too much detail about toning because I think it's kind of out of the scope of this video. I still wanted to cover it though, because I thought that it was cool. In any case, to get started, I had to first make a tannin solution, and I went with instant coffee. I just boiled about 500 mils of water in the microwave and I added 2 large spoonfuls. I mixed it until it all dissolved, and then I let it cool down to around room temperature. When the tannin solution was ready, I started the actual process. The first step is to bleach the print, and this is usually done using sodium carbonate, also known as washing soda. So I dissolved about a teaspoon of it in a liter of distilled water, and I added it to the container. I decided to try it out with a print of Arcadi's flower photo, but this time I made sure that it was properly exposed and properly oriented. I pre-wet it by running it under the tap, and then I dropped it in. The slightly basic solution quickly attacked the Prussian blue and turned it into brown ferric hydroxide and a soluble ferrocyanide salt. Getting the timing of the bleaching step can be quite hard because you don't want to bleach it too much or too little. It's also important to know that the bleaching doesn't stop the moment it's taken out, and it keeps going until it's all washed off. I decided to not let it go completely yellow, and I kept some blue in it. When all the sodium carbonate was washed off, I added it to the instant coffee. It started darkening relatively quickly, and it was because of a reaction between the acidic tannins in coffee and the ferric hydroxide. They form a complex with the iron, and the final color depends on the tannins that were present. The typical thing to do is to then flip over the print and let it react upside down so that the photo part is always in contact with the liquid. It's also a good idea to shake things around and to make sure that no bubbles are trapped underneath. I let it sit there for a few hours, and then I took it out, washed it with water, and let it dry. The bleaching step has a tendency to wash things out, so the print now looked a bit faded. This is why, if you're planning to tone a cyanotype, it's often recommended to slightly overexpose it to counteract this effect. This made me curious though, and I wanted to see if I could maybe recover my overexposed Singapore print. This time though, I decided to try it with green tea instead. The final result was a darker and blacker tone, but it wasn't able to recover much of anything. I wanted to mess around with toning a bit more, so I developed a couple more photos that were sent to me. This first one was sent by Harry from Tennessee, and it was a photo taken in Boulder, Colorado. And the second one was taken by John from London, England. For John's print, I did it with a large cup of McDonald's coffee, and the result was very close to the instant coffee. For Harry's, I tried it with black tea, and the tone was a bit darker with a slight red tinge. The last thing that I wanted to try was to see if I could tone a print without the bleaching step. And at the same time, I wanted to see if I could use the green tea to further darken one that was underexposed. So I used my other Singapore print from before, and I just added it directly to the tea. Then I left it there overnight, pulled it out the next day, and let it dry. This time, instead of becoming black like the other run with green tea, it actually kind of looked red. It was still technically underexposed, but I think that the overall darkening and the staining of the paper did a really good job at hiding it. Anyway, I think that's about it for this project. I honestly had a lot of fun doing it, and if you think you're interested in trying it yourself, I really recommend it. As I said earlier, you don't have to be like me and make the chemicals yourself, and you can often just order them online. I know that at least in the US and Canada, there are many places to get it from, but I can't really comment about anywhere else in the world. In any case, I'm now just going to give a quick shout out to the sponsor of this video, NordVPN. After that though, I'm going to be doing another giveaway, so if you're interested in entering, be sure to stick around till the end. NordVPN is an extremely useful service that helps keep your personal information safe on the internet. What I like about it most is that because it encrypts your data, it makes being on public Wi-Fi a lot safer. If you're unprotected, it's possible to have your passwords or even your credit card info stolen. With NordVPN though, it's nearly impossible, which really helps put my worries at ease. I actually just got back from a 10-day trip through the US, and I used NordVPN every day to log into YouTube and to check my emails. I used it on my laptop and my phone, and they have a really easy to use app for both. All I had to do was just click one button and wait for it to tell me that I was connected. NordVPN also prevents outside sources, like your internet service provider, from peeking in on what you're doing, and it generally helps keep you anonymous. On top of this, it has many other perks that I haven't even mentioned, like a built-in ad and malware blocker. Anyway, with that being said, if you're looking to up your internet security and privacy, you should definitely check out NordVPN. They're offering all my viewers 77% off 3-year plans, which you can get by going to nordvpn.com/NileRed, using the code NileRed, or by just clicking the link in the description. Okay, with all that done, let's get into the details of the giveaway. For this one, I'm going to be randomly choosing 4 winners who can send me a digital photo and I'll make a cyanotype with it. I'll then ship the original print anywhere in the world, free of charge. It's also free to enter, and you just need to either visit my Instagram or follow me on Twitter or YouTube. The URL to do this is on the screen here, or you can click the link in the description. As usual, a big thanks goes out to all my supporters on Patreon. Everyone who supports me can see my videos at least 24 hours before I post them to YouTube. Also, everyone on Patreon can directly message me, and if you support me with $5 or more, you'll get your name at the end like you see here.